Okay, thank you, Jason. So I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about some things that I've been thinking about for quite some time. And I took as my starting point this word integrated in the name of iEarth. And of course, there's a straightforward way in which we can think of integrated being the national consortium. And I think that's fine. That's not the interpretation I'm going to go for here. I'm going to talk about a few other meanings of integrated that tend to pop up when we talk about education. So first, just a little reminder, if I can get my slides to move here. So these are known as stomach diagrams in earth sciences. So it's a typical way for us to present how we view different processes on different scales and how we sort of think about and do science on different spatial and temporal scales. So it's about different kinds of dynamics that interact. And this is a way for us to kind of sort of represent those different scales. And this is not unique, of course, to oceans and atmosphere. We find similar diagrams. Here is biology, forest ecosystems with different scales of disturbance and response and so on and so forth, and different scales at which we collect data to do our science on these different scales. And here's a geodynamics example that we know. This was, I guess this package was presented at GLF at one point. And then we can move to these sort of socio-ecological systems, okay, that are dealt with in these relatively new fields of sustainability science, resilience studies. And they focus then on these very large complex systems with network dynamics. They look at multi-scale interactions. And this is sort of a key thing, is that these processes on different scales interact across scales. And so it's very important, it's an explicit phenomenon in these kinds of systems that causal power can emerge at higher levels. So it's not just smaller scale processes describing the fundamental processes that then act upwards. There has to be causal power working the other way around. And so we see these little funny figure 8 drawings on the left where, well, this is inspired by ecosystem dynamics and these adaptive cycles that interact on small and large scale. So small and fast processes get dampened by large and slow processes. And the key I want to make here, or the sort of point I want to make here, is that in common sense reasoning, we kind of need this kind of concept. And in a very large part of scientific reasoning and scientific explanations, we need the emergence of causal power. And this idea of strong emergence. So it's not just higher level phenomena or combinations of the lower level phenomena, but higher level phenomena can influence causally the processes that constitute the higher level. Okay, so we just have to keep that in mind as we progress. There's another example looking at climate. The other one was health or whatever. So these large real world wicked problems that we know that earth sciences play a role in, they bring up these issues when we need to tackle them. Okay, if we look a little bit at earth sciences, plural, this has been described as a large connectome of natural science disciplines that study the Earth and other planets. And the example used in this paper is just, well, just look at the 22 so-called divisions in EGU, here in alphabetical order. And these are, when you look at them, more or less arbitrary subdivisions. And you could partition this in all sorts of different ways. There's some overlap. And the key point that I want to make here is that, well, if you think about these different ways of doing earth science, and within each of these categories, there's all sorts of different things going on. We can think of the idea of epistemic pluralism. Okay, so there are multiple ways to obtain and validate knowledge, multiple ways to create and accept explanations. Okay? And this in some ways is not very controversial, but in other ways, pluralism might sound a little bit negative. Maybe, do we really want pluralism, right? Is it some kind of anything goes? It's a bit tricky. So it's useful to keep in mind that there's pluralism also in mathematics. So you would think that if there is one epistemic project out there that has a standard, and that there's no kind of pluralism going on, it would be mathematics. But this, of course, is not the case. There's all sorts of different ways of thinking about what constitutes a proof, and so on and so forth. And philosophers then try to analyze how the structure of mathematics can support this kind of pluralism. Now, in the earth sciences, if you look at all this diversity and all the different ways of doing what we put in that category, in some ways that, well, okay, there's a thriving diversity of different ways of doing things, but there's also knowledge fragmentation. It's kind of good and bad in a way. And if you look at the concept of interdisciplinarity, now Kleinhans said that earth sciences consist of many, many disciplines. Now, in general, typically disciplines are used for these larger domains of knowledge. So in this particular representation, you would say, well, if you put together social scientists, natural scientists, and legal scientists, you have a multidisciplinary team, but the interdisciplinarity is in that intersection, if it exists, between natural sciences and other kinds of sciences, or social and legal, or whatever. And then you have transdisciplinary, where you have academics and non-academics, the intersection of that. But the point, I think, is that this is kind of scale independent, or it's self-similar on different scales. So yes, this can be the different domains or the different disciplines, humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, or it could be within the natural sciences, or it could be within one of the divisions of the EDU, or it could be within a research group within one of those. So it's kind of self-similar on different scales. This is a famous saying, of course, the world has problems, but universities have departments, so there's not much we can do with those problems. And then interdisciplinarity is this thing that policymakers and funding agencies have been pushing very aggressively for many decades, okay? And part of the reason is, of course, these global challenges that we need to contribute to solving. Problem, of course, is what is an academic discipline? And if you look at the sort of sociological or anthropological viewpoint, well, disciplines are reservoirs of ways of knowing that condition behavioral practices, sets of discourses, ways of thinking, procedures, emotional responses, and motivations. They have internal hierarchies and bestow power differentially, conferring advantage and disadvantage. And so then from this kind of perspective, it's not so much about science and knowledge. It's kind of chimpanzee behavior in a way. And if you look at trying to be an interdisciplinary academic, people that study this in this particular case, Catherine Lyle looked at, she revisited interdisciplinary academics 20 years after she had interviewed them. And the idea is that it would become easier to be an interdisciplinary academic as the world moved on, but there is still no sign that there is any institutional or systemic support for being interdisciplinary in the sense of crossing the humanities, social sciences, natural sciences. So being interdisciplinary in that sense is a career risk. It can be quite dangerous, in fact. It's another example of a little self-help guidebook for interdisciplinarity that has some quite gloomy sentences in there. So Gunilla Öberg says, well, academic structures seem to feed disciplinary arrogance. Respectful attitudes challenged by the pecking order. Okay, and then there's this phenomenon that natural sciences are just self-evident. They're normal. Okay, and then humanities, social sciences, well, they are not normal. And so they have to sort of defend themselves of what they're doing in one. Natural sciences don't have to. But then if you look at this, of course, graduates in the humanities and social sciences, they are expected to gain a deep understanding during their studies of the research process, research design, philosophy of science, and that they should be able to reflect on this when designing their own research. So here's, well, just a brief reminder of philosophy. And I mean, as natural scientists, we get what we did examen philosophicum, 1,000 years ago in my case. And I don't know, they don't have to do that anymore, right? Or they can, they can do it later in the.
Yeah, they do it in third semester.
Yeah, and here's sort of one of these main things, right? Epistemology, what's knowledge, metaphysics, what exists, what is reality. Of course, value theory is stuff that we feel that we don't have to deal with anyway. Now, in the social sciences, now I just grabbed an example, textbook in research methods for business students. And I mean, here's the research onion, the outer layer is the philosophy, and then you have the approach to theory development, and then methods, how to approach that. And students need to be able to understand these different layers and how they interact, and they need to reflect on how the beliefs and assumptions and research philosophy and research design are connected. And this, by and large, is not something we do in the natural sciences. So we would sit up here at the top, it says positivism. So that's where we all sit, according to the social scientists. And so what we do is real anyways, we don't have to work. Okay, put in a nutshell. Let's see, then I have to do this. Okay, so this means that there's another hierarchy here. So there's a hierarchy with natural sciences seeing themselves as being above the others, but then natural scientists then come across as deeply ignorant in the eyes of the others. And that's another hierarchy. And so in this book, Gunilla offers some advice for balancing respect with confidence. Okay. Now, I would like to take a different approach than interdisciplinarity when thinking about this issue. I like the concept of epistemic fluency, because disciplines are so scale-free and can be all sorts of things. What cuts across all of these is this notion of epistemic fluency. So we can think of that as a capacity to sort of embrace and combine different kinds of knowledge and ways of knowing, acting, and being relevant to real-world situations. So it consists of several elements then, the ability to integrate different kinds of knowledge. Here, the example that they use in these studies that relate to professional education is, for example, this problem of combining theoretical and practical. The theoretical understanding you gain at university and the know-how you need when you go into the real world. Okay, these are often disconnected and they occur in separate places. Okay, so this speaks to some of the issues we are dealing with in the internships and other situations. And it's not just about filling your head with knowledge, but about being able to weave, developing the skill to weave different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of knowing. And that includes materials and technologies. And students and professionals need skillfulness in creating this environment and the tools that they need, because they may or may not be pre-constructed. Okay, and so if you want to gain actionable knowledge, this knowledge that is useful for getting things done, well, that is a matter of interaction between your embodied mind and the environment, including tools and social others. Okay, now I'm gonna get back to epistemic fluency towards the end. I'm just gonna switch to reality for a moment. Okay. Now, I subscribe to New Scientist, which is a wonderful magazine. I have a love-hate relationship with New Scientist, and so I collected a bunch of covers where they speak about reality. Okay, and when New Scientist mentions reality, you know that it's about quantum physics or particle physics. That is the discipline that has special claim to probing the nature of reality. Okay, and I found this interesting example from a few years ago, where the cover says, "Why the laws of the universe explain everything except you." And so the heading inside here on that feature article is, can physics ever make sense of human agency, our power to change the physical world at will? Okay. And so here they interview theoretical physicists. These are very famous physicists, very high profile. And I don't want to insinuate that what comes across in this article necessarily represents their view on the world. That this is an editorial decision that New Scientist makes. So they will remain anonymous. Okay. So theoretical physicist one says, well, we see agents that make choices and exert a causal influence on what happens in the world. And then science comes along and says, hey, you're actually just a bunch of particles or atoms, and you're just obeying differential equations. It seems quite a dramatic project to explain mind and consciousness as emerging out of atoms and molecules, bumping into one another. Okay. And then theoretical physicist 2 says, I want to somehow find minimal intellectual tools for understanding how something can work that you would describe as an agent and still be compatible with physics, implying that agency and the way we understand it is not. And then the article kind of turns towards the end and changes its tone a little bit. And it says, well, in the end, it might turn out to be less about what physics can tell us about agency and more about what agency can tell us about physics. And theoretical physicist 3 says, I don't believe that physics is necessarily as fundamental as most of us have been led to believe. Okay, and then they say something to the effect that, well, physics is just extremely good at dealing with the kinds of problems that fit into this box that we call physics. Okay. So anyway, so that sets the stage for, I mean, again, the idea is not to claim that individual physicists have certain views in this particular case. But the way New Scientist, as a very wide-read popular magazine, portrays this issue is a sign of a larger cultural phenomenon. Okay. And of course, in philosophy, we know this as reductionism. Okay. The metaphysical thesis that reality is basically leveled in this way. It's a layer cake. And this is the point of contention for this is not the leveling maybe and the emergence. The point of contention here is that the red arrows only point one way. Causality can only go from the bottom of physics to everything else. And this kind of situation has led to a very large split, if you will, in views on what science is. Okay, so you could go with the extreme position of the naive realist saying, well, the world is real, that's what I see, what's the big deal? To, well, on the other hand, on the other side, well, you know, science can be useful in some context, whether or not it's real is kind of irrelevant. And then there's everything in between. And I didn't make this figure, so I cannot vouch for, you know, the correct position of all of these viewpoints in here. But the point is to raise this kind of curious fact that the point of the perspective of anti-realism has emerged as a way to rescue science from realism, which is a strange situation to be in. And understanding why that happened is a little bit tricky. So to understand it, we have to understand what is known as the substance paradigm. Okay, substance paradigm. Now this goes back to the pre-Socratics. Okay, that postulated certain properties that needed to be satisfied for ontology, for being. It should be simple, unchangeable. There were primary substances, and the atomists claiming that, well, there are these primary constituents with eternal properties. This was consolidated by Aristotle in his metaphysics. And so ever since Aristotle, basically, Western thinking has been dominated by this point of view, that reality has to consist of concrete, countable, particular individuals, little things, essentially small marbles that bump into each other. And these entities underlie processes and dynamics. So processes have to happen to something. Now, the modern day variant of this is what we might call particle physicalism. Okay? So everything in the world is composed of elementary basic particulars whose properties and relations are sufficient to determine all that happens in the world. Okay, now this viewpoint is a lot more sophisticated than it might seem at first. And as an example, if you look at Jaegwon Kim's work, he did a series of papers in the 90s where he developed a very powerful argument where he showed essentially that while all causality resides in the most fundamental particles, whatever they might be, an emergence of causal power at higher levels is impossible, okay? Unless you go metaphysical dualism, saying there's some separate realm in which these higher levels operate. And this argument is very solid, okay? And that raises huge issues, right? Because without emergence, how can we make sense of life or mind? Or as in the case of a theoretical physicist, agency, how do we make sense of it? We have to make sense of it. Physics must be able to deal with this. But then, of course, the counter argument is that Kim's argument is valid indeed, but it is unsound because the premises are false. Okay, and to see that, the best resource to see this is the work of Johanna Zeit, okay? Contemporary philosopher. She's at the University of Aarhus. And so she has basically done the work sort of excavating all the underlying presuppositions, so implicit, unquestioned assumptions that have perpetuated this, what she calls the myth of substance. Okay? And one of the most important ones is this insistence that for an entity to be a concrete individual, it must be uniquely located and countable and particular. This is not necessary, basically. And then she shows that the core problems in ontology, which also has problems for many sciences, are in fact generated by the substance paradigm. So these are problems that we don't need to have. And many questions in science are in fact rendered absurd because of this. Okay, and she has then developed a process ontology that deals with the consequences of abandoning all of these presuppositions, which is some very exciting stuff. Okay, and that's her ontology is called general process theory. I'm just going to go through some of that quickly so that we get a rough idea. Okay, so it's an ontological theory that describes the structure of the domains we talk about in scientific theories or indeed in any language. And it's not restricted to Indo-European languages, which kind of is biased towards talking about things, okay? Unlike many other languages that are more process oriented. It operates with a single category called general process or dynamics, it's the same thing, that has very precise category features, okay? That includes being general, not particular, okay? It's localized by context and measurement. It is subjectless, so it doesn't necessarily have to be done, performed by something, or it doesn't necessarily modify underlying things. It is temporally extended, it cannot be instantaneous or static. It's measurable, but not countable, identified through dynamic acts such as measurement. And contextual, so it's identified by its dynamic context. And processes are distinguished not by how they decompose into definite things or structures, but by participation in the dynamic context and the part-whole relationship that they have. Now, this theory allows us to give precise and compact definitions of different dynamic interactions. So we can describe precisely what it means for something to be a causal interaction or a mechanism or a function, or to be a self-maintaining process, or recursively self-maintaining. We'll look at examples of that. Here's, for example, is a definition of what it means for dynamics to be a mechanism, okay? So it's a formal theory that allows you to describe these very precisely. Okay, and in this ontology, strong emergence and downward causality are not problematic at all. They're non-issues. And it's not anti-reductionist, because reductive causal explanation is just a special case. It's not anti-mechanistic. Mechanistic causal explanation is a special case, and so on and so forth. So it's a much more integrated worldview. It's technically not a metaphysics, but it paves the way for one that has been named process realism. Okay. And process realism, I think, is the way to go. Okay, so basically the world is process all the way up and all the way down. Okay, and the stability of a process is determined by the context and the interactions with other processes. And you can think of processes that are energy well stable, like atoms, that could be stable on cosmological timescales. And you have far from equilibrium stable processes, such as organisms, that need constant input and interaction with energy, other processes with enough energy to sustain themselves. And then scientific models, they identify processes in the world that appear as dynamic participants within our experiments or our observations or interventions, whatever we do when we do our science. And process realism is very, very well attuned to how physics works and its practice, but it takes other sciences equally seriously, and this is the key point. Different dynamic contexts are equally real and equally fundamental. And so this has the potential to sort of break this impasse between orthodox realism, the substance, particle, physicalist thing realism, and the anti-realism that emerged to try to rescue science from that realism. Because processes are real, and they are compatible with the anti-realist epistemology. Okay. So now we can replace these endless arguments about, reductionism or whatever, with the more fruitful task of proper characterization of interaction dynamics. That should be our task. Now, I want to show an example of how this kind of process realism enables a reconceptualization of psychology, basically, and offers a way to naturalize the mind and mental processes. And that's Mark Bickert's interactivist model. Now, this is work that goes back to the early 70s. He has a book called The Whole Person, which is supposed to be published later this year. And this book has been forthcoming since I was born, which gives me some, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. So you would see him referring to his book as forthcoming for decades, but anyway. So this is grounded in process metaphysics and the need for metaphysical strong emergence. Okay. It explains how normativity emerges from a non-normative phenomenon. Okay, so that's the naturalism element. Okay, function, dysfunction, true, false representation. Action is the basis of cognition. So in that sense, it has kinship with the classic Piaget and other models, but takes it further by being grounded in process metaphysics. And it forces an emergent constructivism. So the world cannot impress itself into a passive mind. A competent interaction system must be constructed. Okay? And it offers rich resources for modeling, learning, development, personhood, social ontology, language, and ethics. Okay, so here's just my attempt to put some of these issues that are addressed in the interactivist model on a figure in a way, where of course the web of interaction can be excruciatingly complex when you get into social processes, and these are all emergent. Okay, so from equilibrium stable processes, some of them are self-maintaining, like a candle flame is a self-maintaining process until the wax runs out. organisms are recursively self-maintaining. They can maintain their own self-maintenance. And that's where normativity arises. Actions can have a function that serves a purpose to maintain a self-maintaining process. And from this, you get representation, error detection, learning, intentionality, motivation, personhood, social ontology, and language, and so on. So this offers a naturalization of agency, speaking to the problem that the physicists were scratching their heads about in the New Scientist article. Okay. This is perfectly compatible with physics. Now I want to jump to this idea of active learning that we've been talking about for years in iEarth and other settings. And I just want to highlight this model by Doug Lombardi that contrasts, let's say, traditional teaching, where the teacher basically makes sense of the different, elements of a knowledge domain and then tries to beam that into the student. And this would be the sort of signet ring in wax world pressing itself into the passive mind. Okay. And then active learning being this social constructivist ecosystem. And the key in defining active learning is that it is a didactic situation that affords students agency for their learning. Okay? And agency is this capability to make choices and act on them in ways that make a difference. And agency for learning involves intentionality, forethought, self-regulation, self-efficacy, these elements. Okay. And the interactivist model of Mark Bickard can be used to set this kind of understanding of learning into a process realist framework. And agency is linked to this concept of affordances. Okay, so from a process or interaction perspective, agency is not something that a person has. Agency emerges in the interaction of people, organization, and materials, technology, and other spaces. And other. It can be integrated with the idea of affordances. Affordances has two main interpretations in the literature. Affordance can be a property of a material or technology, so it affords you possible actions. So people working in design and software development say that they build affordances into their design, so allowing people to do certain things. The other interpretation is that it's a cognitive thing, it's how you perceive it. So I could use my laptop as a paperweight. That's not something that the designer built into it as an affordance, but I perceive it as such. Now this difference can then be integrated if we merge it with the concept of emergent agency and an interactivist model. So in Bickard's view, there are indications of interactive possibilities that are always tested in situations through action. And this construction of this pragmatic situation knowledge must be learned, must be constructed, must be updated all the time. And this essentially is a process metaphysically grounded version of affordances that is rooted in action. And these three bubbles, if you look at the three bubbles on the view of agency, mirrors ideas for educational design, saying that it emerges in the interaction between the epistemic, the material, and the social. Okay, and these three bubbles, to some extent, we can design them. So we can design some of the epistemic elements. Okay, we can design some of the materials and the technologies. We can design some of the social configurations. What we cannot design is the emergent learning. So agency for learning emerges in this interaction here that involves co-creating and co-configuring what occurs during learn time. Okay, so I want to return to this idea of epistemic fluency because there's a whole literature on the role of technology in supporting epistemic fluency. Okay, so, well, technology creates new opportunities. Okay, this is the affordance and indication of possible action idea. there are dangers, right? Offloading cognitively demanding work to technologies poses risks, such as using ChatGPT for everything. And professionals need to weave their thinking with the processing done by tools. And it allows this transcendence of place and time, because it can be mobile. And they highlight the use of dashboards and other tools that improve our situational awareness. And so that is analogous to Picard's situation knowledge. We need to constantly update and revise our situation knowledge. And that gives us opportunity to do newer and better things. And it can give rise to collective agency and allows us to respond to emerging circumstances in a better way. And that brings me to some of the work that we are then doing in iEarth. Okay? And we can think of an integrated education as a way for us to scaffold for greater epistemic fluency. And that allows, I think in my view, it requires process realism, because then different scales and different dynamic contexts, different parts of our discipline do not have greater claim on probing reality than others. And therefore we can level the playing field a little bit better and see how we actually have a common ground. Then we can leverage technology to improve our situation knowledge and give new interaction possibilities so we can see how these things can be connected. Okay, and that can improve agency both for teachers and for students. And then the interactivist view of learning and social ontology allows us to merge our process realist view with what education is about. So it's a very integrated worldview that supports all of the different epistemic perspectives that we need in order to do this. Okay. So that is my suggestion for how we might move forward towards a more integrated education. And that's it. I don't know how much time I've spent, but thanks.
Thanks a lot. Helped a lot.
Thank you, Bjarte. Does anyone have any questions? I know Torgny has a few.
If you wait for 6 months or so, when I have digested all this, thank you, Bjarte. It was a lot of things to think about.
Yeah, this idea of process thinking is strange because it feels very familiar, but then it's also very, very foreign, and we tend to slip into this thing thinking, thing speaking, thing talking all the time, and it's, according to Johannes Eid, this is part of the problem of Indo-European languages. They're kind of structured in this way, and so it's extremely difficult for us to sort of think about a process, have this process mindset. So in many other languages, it would be no problem to say that, I am now Bjarte, upwardly or something. I mean, you can think processually when you speak, and this is very difficult for us to do. So it requires a little bit of a shift, but at the same time, again, this is what we want to do as scientists. We want to understand processes and interactions on multiple scales. So it's very familiar in that sense.